Thank you very much for having me today, everyone. My name is Chudley, and as it says, hopefully in large words behind me on the screen, I'm here to talk to you about driving SEO in large, complex organizations. Now, I know that we have a mixed audience here today. Not everyone will be directly responsible for SEO, but really what this talks about is managing technical programs in large organizations. So even if you aren't responsible for SEO, hopefully there'll be something of value for you today. But before we begin, I'm mindful that it's the first session after lunch. There might be a little bit of lethargy in the room, and there's a responsibility on the part of the speaker to inject some energy back in. Unfortunately, I don't really do jokes, which is a little bit of a problem. But what I can offer you in the spirit of openness and transparency is I can give you a confession. I would only ask that Chatham House rules apply, that it doesn't go beyond these four walls. Because it's quite career limiting for me. But that confession, and I can't believe I'm about to tell a room full of people this, but my confession is that I am very, very bad at my job. Okay? I appreciate that there was laughter there. There wasn't just stony silence where people were like, yeah, we know. But the reason I tell you that is because this is not a technical talk. Okay, there are people far better qualified in this room to give you technical advice than I can. What I can give you is my experience of managing technical programs in these organizations. But it's exactly that, it's my experience. So what I want you to do is kind of everything that I'm about to say, I kind of want you to imagine it in kind of big brackets, or kind of better yet, at the end, I kind of want a big asterisk to flash after I finish speaking that kind of basically says, according to Joe, because this is my experience. It's based on my management style, my communication style, the organizational context I found myself in, and it may not necessarily apply to the situations you find yourself in. So if we jump into it. Oh, that was the first slide I was expecting. Let's move on. So I'm going to quickly kind of talk about the problem as I understand it. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about this because we all know the nature of the problem in search today. AI is transforming everything in front of us. And if we go back to what Rory was saying earlier today about that explore and exploit sort of mindset, I think we know that explore is where we're going to drive value, but actually the exploit elements, where that mindset where we're still delivering, we're having to deliver against those financial objectives, that stays the same. And really what I'm finding in SEO is that that's a real challenge, because if you're like me, we've kind of spent years trying to build the commercial credibility of an SEO program. And ultimately that's the ground beneath our feet is kind of changing, and that's a very difficult conversation to have with businesses, particularly when there's not necessarily as much technical understanding. So my main point really is that large organizations aren't always ready for this type of change. You might have slow decision-making or fragmented ownership. And if you're dealing with stakeholders that don't have this kind of technical knowledge of what's happening in the industry, that's going to be a real problem. And another thing is that, this is all stuff that we're dealing with in the industry, but in a large organization, that's, not necessarily central to the operating model. There might be other challenges that the business is facing. Excuse me. And that means that those organizational priorities can change really, really quickly. And ultimately, you can be doing everything right and still lose some performance, or not being able to necessarily understand where your performance is as those metrics change, as visibility changes. And that's a really difficult position to kind of frame credibly in boardrooms. So what I want to do now is just talk about some of those organizations that I've worked in, and really give you some illustrative examples of those challenges that you might face. I've had to change some of the details for commercial sensitivities, but really this is just to give you an idea of, like I say, those challenges. Now, I'm going to talk to you about two case studies. The first is the Met Office, which is weather, not the Metropolitan Police. And following up on what Rory said, we were trying to get feels like temperature into our products and services, so apologies to Rory, we've obviously not quite nailed it. And then the other case study I'm going to talk to you about is Great Western Railway. Now, the observant among you will realise that I'm talking about two businesses, weather and trains, two things that the British public love to moan about. I am looking to try and add queuing into that mix so I can become the world's leading expert on British moaning. But the other thing that those two organizations have in common is you wouldn't necessarily expect mature SEO programs to kind of sit in those organizations. So the Met Office, it doesn't have a product to sell as such. And GWR is nearly 200 years old. So SEO has had to adapt into that organization. It certainly hasn't been there from the outset. And that brings certain challenges. So if we look at the Met Office first, so let's dig into a bit of detail about this. So the Met Office is an arm's length body. What's an arm's length body? Well, I've got a very convoluted explanation that I'm going to read verbatim off the screen, but an arm's length body is a public organization operating independently of government, but sponsored or funded to provide a public service. Now, in my opinion, that already has an inherent contradiction in there. Like, how can an organization operate independently whilst also receiving funding? Like, you've already got two different strands of influence and governance that you're going to have to navigate within that. And if we actually look in a little bit more detail here about that kind of governance structure that we sat in now, again, the names have changed partly because I can't remember exactly what they were all called. But what we can see is that we had a digital team that fed into a services director and a markets and product director and steering groups and exec groups. And this is actually a simplified version of what we were dealing with. But it's also not unusual for large organizations to have that many layers of kind of governance and decision making. Excuse me. And what you can see is that that's going to take a long time for decisions at the top to cascade down. And equally, in my position, right at the bottom of that totem pole, very difficult to influence up at times. And one of the issues there is that that's all different people. That's lots of different teams. It's different levels of technical knowledge. It's misalignment at times. So that's always going to be really difficult to navigate. And at the Met Office, so we initially had a strategy that was we wanted people to use Met Office data for our own products and channels. So website and app, easy. SEO has a really clear place in that strategy. But then that strategy changed and the goal became sort of use of Met Office data through third parties, not necessarily our own apps, which then meant that SEO didn't quite have the same remit. Now, that didn't mean that all those goals that I was working towards just stopped and I could put my feet up. That meant that we had to navigate that organizational change while still delivering against those goals, delivering in that kind of that exploit mindset, which was a challenge. And really what that meant was that we just had sort of decisions or sort of influence and capability across a lot of different layers, but that meant accountability was fragmented. We had slow decision making. And that essentially we just had a capability that was very reactive and it was never urgent until it absolutely was, and it was always too late, which I'm sure people may have experienced in other circumstances. If we look at GWR as well, that's another large organization, one of which, so 6,000 colleagues, one of which is my wife who works in HR. When I did this talk with her, she told me that that's wrong. There's actually over 7,000 colleagues now, so apologies. But the interesting thing about GWR is that it's gone through so much structural change in its time. So it's been operating for nearly 200 years. It's founded in 1835 by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. We love Izzy at GWR, and I am contractually obliged to get at least one mention of Isambard Kingdom Brunel in. So that's done, check, good. It's nationalized in 1948. It's then privatized again in the 90s, and it's acquired by First Group, who are our current owning group, until the 13th of December 2026, when we will once again become nationalized, which is the result of a 2-year program that began under Labour in 2024. Now, that doesn't mean that on the 14th of December, we just suddenly become a well-functioning public entity. That governance change is going to take so much time, particularly when you're moving from commercial priority to public priority. That's not going to be set overnight. That's going to take a long time to cascade down. So those governance groups are all going to have to change. That's going to mean we have different stakeholders with different levels of technical knowledge. And again, all the while, you know, on December 14th, I can't say to my manager, okay, well, all those program goals we were working towards, they're no longer relevant, and put my feet up. You know, that is still going to be something that I'm judged upon and the team are judged upon. So that's really difficult to navigate, particularly when that's the organizational context we're dealing with, but then you have the industry context. Again, Sam Altman's not going to stop. I'm not going to be able to call him and say, have a day off, mate. We are really, really under the cosh. So you are constantly dealing with these organizational changes as well as these industry challenges. And really, when you put SEO in these complex environments, the outcomes are pretty predictable. And again, I've kind of touched on these, but these might be things that you've noticed in your own programs. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not particular to large, complex organizations, but what you might find is that you'll lose influence and autonomy. If you've got capability spread across a lot of teams, that accountability becomes diminished and diluted sometimes. And what we often find is that strategic decisions are being made without technical input and consultancy, and that always causes problems. So that's something that you always have to navigate and pick up from. Your roadmap is going to absolutely collapse, particularly if the organizational priorities are going to change, because that's going to happen before you might be able to deliver impact, particularly on long-term initiatives. And one of the things that I've noticed working in these types of organizations is that things like re-platforming or contractual obligations or procurement exercises, these are things that large organizations have to do. They're really important to do, but they are an overhead to manage. And that means that that's going to impede your ability to continue delivering. And really what that means is that you end up with things that stay on the backlog, long-term initiatives never get completed. And the main point there is that opportunity cost is real. All the while this is happening, you slow decision-making, you've got missed opportunities, and your competitors are moving faster. And what we've probably all seen is that if those losses compound over time, the bigger that gap becomes, the harder it is to bridge. And that means it's harder to secure investment to continue bridging that gap. And that can sometimes be a little bit of a death spiral. And really the point here is that your roadmap doesn't fail because it was wrong. It fails because it couldn't survive the system it was operating in. So what I want to do here is just talk about some practical tips and ways of framing your programs that might help you navigate this. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, this stuff is really basic. It's almost insultingly basic, but it's the 5 things that I think if you do this, then you will have a robust, resilient program that can navigate any type of change. Maybe not any, but most types of change. So the first one, understand how decisions are made. It's really obvious, right? We're probably all doing this already. But one of the pitfalls I had earlier in my career was that I kind of built advocacy and influence in the implementation layer. So in cross-functional teams, that was great. It meant I could deliver a lot faster. But when I needed that strategic decision-making, all I'd done was pass the problem along. Those teams then weren't able to influence their decision-makers because I didn't really understand their strategic context, and that was a real problem. So how are you going to do this? Well, you need to be aligning to the strategic objectives of your cross-functional teams. You need to understand how the work that you do feeds into that. And really what you want to be doing is building credibility before you actually need it. Anchor SEO and governance. This is not sexy. I know it's really, really boring, and I've just given you slides that say that governance can be a bit of a problem, but you do need some level of governance. The reason for this is because, like I said, these are the basic things, but you can quite easily not be doing them if you don't give yourself that governed structure to operate in. It might be days, weeks, months, and before you know it, it's 6 months down the line. You don't know if your roadmap is still aligned to the business goals and everything's treeing into those objectives. So you need to build governance as a bit of a safety net to give you the opportunity to step back and reassess and course correct if you need to. What you don't want is so much governance that you're not able to deliver, and you need to kind of strike that balance and understand the kind of the minimum viable amount of governance where you can give yourself that safety net. So whether that's embedding SEO in your briefing forms, your standards, your delivery models, your definitions of done, and really trying to reduce reliance on individuals and standardize as much as you can. Again, I'm really sorry. I know probably everyone in this room is already doing this if you're in SEO, but translate it into business language. The reason we do that is because we're trying to bypass that or reduce that reliance on technical explanations. If we're able to understand how our program goals tree into those business KPIs, then we won't have to rely on technical justification or explanation because we're already speaking in the language that executives are going to care about. That is really hard at the moment because, at the moment, those metrics that I used to rely on, I don't quite understand how they fit into the new model. And, you'd really want to have an understanding of statistical correlation, how your goals are actually treeing into that. But that's something, the greater fidelity you have in that conversation, the more you're going to be able to affect those decision makers, and really starting to use the terms that they value and understand. This is quite a big one, particularly if you're going through periods of significant kind of organizational change where budget might not be available quite so much, but reframe SEO as risk mitigation. Positioning SEO as a defensive strategy can be really effective in these environments. When you're going through change, executives may not want to release budget or invest in things when the outcomes are uncertain, but actually loss aversion in those circumstances is going to be far more effective. No one wants to be the executive that let the bottom fall out of the funnel. So reframing SEO as risk mitigation is really going to be a lever in your arsenal to kind of build that influence. Whether that's protecting existing traffic, reducing dependency on media spend, but these are all tactics that you can do to kind of maintain investment and continue to be able to operate. And really, the other point is that you need to build adaptability into your strategy. There is going to be disruption, so expect it and design around it. That means modular work streams, making sure that if you have large roadmap items, that they are chunked out, that they are delivering value as soon as they can. And you really want to be prioritizing resilience over perfection. And the point here being that a good strategy isn't enough. It needs to be able to survive when the circumstances change. This isn't, again, a well-being talk, but I just quickly want to talk about my personal experience in kind of going through change and navigating these types of complex situations. Recognizing the signs of burnout, this is a key one. Complexity over time, it increases cognitive overload, it affects everyone, and it affects everyone differently. So you need to be self-aware to understand how it's affecting you at any one time. And that's not, obviously there's a personal well-being point to that, but actually you're going to be far more effective if you understand where you are in the change cycle and how you're responding to that. Equally, if you're managing a team, your team will be going through this in different paces, different times, and it's very much that emotional roller coaster. So understanding that means that you're going to be able to be a better manager, a better colleague, and be able to navigate and make sure that you're making rational decisions rather than emotional ones. Uncertainty is inevitable. So Rory said earlier today, humans hate uncertainty. We really do. We strive to control it, or maybe we back away from it. But actually, it's probably inevitable in this field, particularly at the rate of change that we're seeing. So you need to be comfortable and transparent when operating in that uncertainty. And from my perspective, I've actually been able to build credibility in that uncertainty. By being transparent, I've been able to kind of, say, we don't know what this is developing, here's our plan of action. But by admitting that uncertainty, we've actually been able to be a bit more credible. And in some cases, certainty is a little bit of a trap. If you put all your eggs in one basket, and then that bet doesn't pay off, in certain contexts, you may not be able to make that decision again because your credibility is kind of used up. And this is probably the big one for me. And this is maybe something that people in this room won't have dealt with, but in reflection of my immaturity as a manager in my earlier career. Take the emotion out of it. I used to see every failure or blocker as a personal failure, and then sometimes actually I would see it as a failure of the other person, which is a very self-involved way of looking at the world. I know it wasn't something that I projected out. I wasn't a horrible colleague, but it was something that I kind of internalized. And when I actually realized that these blockers are systemic, they're not individual, I was able to actually get to the heart of the problem, to try and understand what the other person was seeing from the other side of the argument, and really being able to kind of actually be a better stakeholder manager and work collaboratively, because we're all kind of moving in the same direction. And navigating complexity feels hard because it is, but you don't need to be certain to be effective. So in closing, what does this all mean? My argument would be that SEO performance or any technical performance is an organizational outcome. The structure and complexity shape what you can deliver, but and the strategy sets the direction, but it's the governance that defines what will survive. SEO reflects the system, not just the tactics. And I actually think, while I said that this was about complex organizations, it's actually about any organization, because there's no such thing as a complex organization. They all are. The advantage that you have is how you navigate that system and understanding that system. Technical expertise might be widespread, but navigating complexity and change isn't. And it's the case that influence and advocacy are going to unlock more growth than any one tactic, and there is no perfect strategy. So the final thought that I want to leave you with is that the teams that succeed aren't the ones with the best plans. They're the ones that can make it work anyway. Thank you very much for your time.